Good morning, Bouts. Gonna welcome to today's story, a touching, humane, and educational tale.
The night Ellie Brooks was thrown out, the wind came across the Wyoming ridge like it had a grudge against the living. She was 16, half frozen, carrying a canvas sack with everything she owned, and clutching a faded blue scarf that was older than her foster name. She had been kidnapped as a little girl, raised in a house that never fully wanted her, and cast out before dark with nowhere to go. Worst of all, she had no road back to the first home she had lost, because she could not remember where it was. This story will show how a broken past does not have to become a broken future, how old winter survival wisdom can still save lives, and how a girl with no place to return to can begin building a place of her own. By the time the front door slammed behind her, the last color had already drained from the sky. The yard was hard with frost. The fence posts wore white edges of snow. The air smelled like iron, wood smoke. In the first real storm of the season, Ellie stood on the porch longer than she should have. Not because she thought her foster father would change his mind, but because every person, no matter how often life has disappointed them, carries one final second of foolish hope, one last breath where they think, maybe this is not really happening. Maybe the door will open again. Maybe someone will say, wait. No one did. She heard the deadbolt slide into place. That sound stayed in her chest longer than the cold. At her feet sat the old canvas sack he had thrown after her. She bent, picked it up, and checked the contents with stiff fingers. 2 dresses, 1 sweater with a split seam at the wrist, a cracked hairbrush, half a loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper, a tin cup, a nearly empty matchbox, and the scarf. The scarf was dark blue once, though time had washed it into something softer, like a winter sky before dawn. It was the oldest thing she owned, older than the Brooks house, older than foster care, older, maybe, than the name Ellie itself. She did not remember who had wrapped it around her neck the first time. She remembered almost nothing from before. Only pieces, a county fair at dusk, colored bulbs shaking overhead, the sweet burnt smell of kettle corn, a woman's voice laughing close behind her, a hand holding hers. Then the terrible absence of that hand. After that, her childhood had become a blur of sheriff's offices, waiting rooms, clipped voices, paper cups of apple juice, and adults asking gentle questions she could not answer. What is your last name? Where do you live? Do you remember your mother's face? She remembered fear. She remembered noise. She remembered crying so hard she made herself sick. But she never remembered the road home. The police had not found her family. Not then, not later, not ever. By 7, she had been placed with the Brookses, a quiet couple on the edge of ranch country. Mrs. Brooks had been kind in a worn-out, practical way. She warmed soup before Ellie asked, fixed hems, brushed tangles from her hair with patient fingers. Once, when Ellie woke from a nightmare and could not breathe right, Mrs. Brooks sat beside her bed until dawn and never acted like it was an inconvenience. For a little while, Ellie had let herself believe that maybe belonging did not have to come all at once. Maybe it could arrive in pieces. A bowl of oatmeal set near her elbow, a blanket from the dryer, a voice calling supper like she was expected to come. Then Mrs. Brooks died, and the house changed. It did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened the way winter settles into the bones of a place, quietly. A little more every day. Her foster father started counting everything. Eggs, firewood, feed, money, gas. Then, sooner or later, he started counting her. Another plate, another pair of boots, another mouth to feed. By 16, Ellie had learned how to move through a room without making sound. She knew how to make herself useful, how to ask for nothing, how to fold her hunger small enough not to be seen. But none of it mattered once hard times pushed bitterness to the surface. That afternoon, he stood in the kitchen with his jaw tight and his hands flat on the table. I did what I could, he said. She said nothing. You're old enough now. Still, she said nothing. Then he looked right at her and delivered the part that would follow her all the way into the dark. I can't keep feeding a girl who isn't mine. Not mine. Some words bruise deeper because they confirm what you were already afraid to believe. Ellie picked up the sack and walked down the porch steps without crying. That was not strength. It was shock. Sometimes pain is too large to show itself right away. She took the county road north because it was the only direction no one had told her not to go. The cold sharpened as the light faded. Snow hissed over the ditches. Her hands went numb, then burned, then numbed again. She ate the bread in 2 careful pieces and kept walking until she saw a lamp glowing through a frosted window at the small county land office near the cattle route. Inside, an older man in a wool coat looked up from his ledger. "You out here alone?" he asked. Ellie almost smiled at the foolishness of the question. "Yes, sir." His name was Harlan Voss. He let her warm her hands at the stove for exactly 3 minutes before county caution returned to his face. But when he asked where she was headed, she pointed through the glass toward the black rise of land in the distance. The ridge stood bare against the whitening earth, high and wind-cut, too exposed for comfort and too empty for company. Mr. Voss frowned. "You don't want that hill. Crosswinds hit from both sides. Snow never settles right. 2 families tried to live there. One left before Christmas. One gave up before spring." Ellie looked at the ridge a long time. Maybe that was why she chose it. Because no one was waiting there to remind her she did not belong. Because when you have no road home, sometimes the loneliest ground in the world feels like the only honest place left. She wrapped the blue scarf tighter around her throat, lifted the sack onto her shoulder, and stepped back into the Wyoming dark. Then, with the wind rising and the ridge ahead of her like a dare, Ellie Brooks began walking toward the coldest place she had ever seen. Ellie reached the ridge well after dark. Up close, it looked even lonelier than it had from the county road. The hill rose out of the white land like something that had been scraped raw. No trees, no brush thick enough to hide behind. No real shelter of any kind. Just frozen grass bent flat under the wind. Patches of hard earth showing through the snow, and a sky so open it made a person feel small the second they stepped under it. She stood there for a moment, breathing through her scarf, listening. The wind did not move around the ridge. It moved through it. It crossed from one side, then shifted and came from another, as if the whole hill had been built to catch every mean thing winter had to offer. But Ellie had already come too far to turn back, and pride, even more than hunger, can keep a person moving long after common sense tells them to stop. So she chose the shallowest dip she could find near the lee side of a rise and got to work. She had seen enough old sheds and ranch outbuildings to know the basics. Low walls, small opening, keep the heat in, keep the weather out. She kicked away the powder snow and started cutting at the frozen turf with the little knife she carried, prying up rough chunks of sod and dirt. It was ugly work, slow work. Her fingers went numb almost at once. The ground fought her every inch. Still, by moonlight and stubbornness, she stacked a crooked little shelter no bigger than a tool shed stall, patched gaps with dead grass, and stretched her sweater over one corner where the wind came through hardest. It was not much, but it was hers. That first night, she crawled inside, wrapped the blue scarf twice around her neck, struck one of her precious matches, and lit a small twist of dry grass in the tin cup. For a few minutes, she watched the flame tremble and thought maybe she had done enough. Then the wind found the seams. It slipped through the cracks in long, icy fingers, carrying fine snow and bitter air. The little flame danced, bent low, and died. Powder blew across her blanket. The cold did not rush in all at once. It settled. It spread. It took the warmth from her feet, then her hands, then the back of her neck. By dawn, Ellie was awake only because sleeping had become too dangerous. When the first gray light came, she crawled out, shivering so hard her teeth hurt. The ridge stood around her, pale and pitiless. She looked at the shelter for a long time, then set her jaw and started over. The second try was tighter. She used more sod, more dirt, more frozen grass. She packed the walls thicker. She sealed every gap she could see. She made the entrance smaller, low enough that she had to crawl. By late afternoon, the little hut looked stronger, denser, smarter. Ellie even allowed herself half a piece of bread in the dangerous comfort of hope. That night, the wind could not get in as easily, but something else did, her own breath. The little shelter held the cold and her damp air together until the walls began to sweat. Then the dampness froze. A thin crust of ice formed along the inside edges. The blanket turned clammy beneath her. The floor stiffened under her knees. By midnight, the place felt less like shelter and more like a box built to store winter itself. Ellie sat with her arms wrapped around her ribs and realized a terrible thing. A shelter could keep out the wind and still fail to keep a person alive. By morning, her hair was tipped with frost. She stumbled outside, stared at the tiny ice crystals lining the roof inside, and let out one sharp, humorless laugh. It vanished into the wind almost as soon as it left her mouth. The third try came after 2 full days of labor and almost no real rest. This time, she built lower to the ground, heavier, meaner looking. She angled the wall to take the hit from the north side and piled stones at the base where she found them poking through the snow. She burned another match just to check how the smoke moved. It curled once, then flattened strangely. Ellie noticed it. She noticed a lot of things. The wind did not stay faithful to one direction on that ridge. It crossed, shifted, doubled back. A wall that made sense at dusk could become useless by midnight. Snow gathered in one place for an hour, then swept clean before dawn. The whole hill seemed restless, unsettled, impossible to predict. Still, by the end of the third day, she was too exhausted to think beyond the next hour. She crawled into the new shelter, wrapped herself in the blanket, and told herself this one would hold. At first, it did. Then sometime in the deepest part of night, a hard side gust slammed the ridge, not from the north. From the open west, Ellie woke to a sound like a fist hitting a door. Then another. Dirt sifted down across her cheek. One of the roof supports groaned. Before she could even crawl clear, the corner above her shoulder gave way, dropping sod, frozen grass, and a spray of powder snow across her legs. She kicked, twisted, dragged herself out into the storm, and fell hard on one knee. The wind tore at her coat. The shelter sagged behind her, like something ashamed to still be standing. For a moment, Ellie stayed there in the snow, breathing in quick, ragged bursts. One gloved hand pressed against the blue scarf at her throat. She thought about the fare she barely remembered. She thought about Mrs. Brooks warming soup on the stove years ago. She thought about the deadbolt sliding shut. And for the first time since leaving the house, the loneliness hit her hard enough to feel physical. Not like sadness, like hunger, like a hollow place opening inside her chest. When dawn finally came, weak and colorless, Ellie stood in front of the collapsed shelter with snow crusted on her sleeves and dirt under her nails. She looked at the broken wall, the scattered sod, the drifted over floor, and understood something she had not wanted to admit. The problem was not just her building. The problem was the ridge itself. And if she did not figure out why that hill seemed determined to strip every bit of warmth from anything living on it, winter was going to finish what the rest of her life had started. Ellie spent the next morning walking the ridge instead of fighting it. That, more than anything, marked the first real change in her. Up until then, she had treated the hill like an enemy to outwork. If she built faster, packed tighter, stayed tougher, maybe she could force it to let her stay. But 3 failed shelters had worn something new into her thinking. She was still stubborn, still hungry, still cold enough that her bones felt hollow. Yet now, beneath all that, she was beginning to understand a harder truth. A person could not win against winter by acting like winter was simple. She climbed slowly, stopping often, studying the land the way she used to study the moods in the Brooks house. Back then, survival had meant learning to notice things before they turned against her. A tight jaw, a slammed cabinet, silence that lasted too long. The ridge had its own kind of warning signs. Snow did not lie evenly across it. That was the first thing she noticed. On one side, the ground was nearly bare, scraped clean by the wind. On another, thin ribbons of drift had gathered behind shallow rises, as if the snow itself preferred certain places and refused others. The frozen grass all leaned the same way in some patches, then reversed farther up. Here and there, the dirt showed through in dark scars, and in those places Ellie found old roots, gray and brittle, buried just under the crust of the earth. Not grass roots, something thicker, shrubs, maybe, small trees once. She crouched and pulled one free. The roots snapped in her hand like dry bone. Ellie stared at it for a long moment. This ridge had not always been naked. That thought stayed with her through the rest of the day. By noon, the sky had gone pale and bright, the kind of winter light that made everything look clean while offering no real warmth. Ellie had just knelt beside another drift line when she heard the sound of hooves below. She stood at once. A horse was coming up from the lower draw, picking its way along a narrow path half hidden under snow. Riding it was a woman wrapped in a dark wool coat, her shoulders square, her face weathered in the way that comes from years spent outdoors without complaint. A bundle of cut wood was tied behind her saddle. She stopped a few yards away and looked from Ellie to the collapsed remains of the third shelter, then back to Ellie. "Well," she said, not unkindly, "you're either the most determined girl in this county or the most exhausted." Ellie said nothing. The woman nodded. as if silence did not offend her. My name's Mara Quinn. I live down in the Cottonwood Draw, north of Miller Creek. Ellie tightened her grip on the broken root in her hand. Did Mr. Voss send you? No. Mara glanced at the ridge. The ridge sent me. Smoke tried to rise from up here yesterday, and then it quit. That usually means trouble. She dismounted with the slow ease of someone who knew exactly where her weight belonged. Then she walked past Ellie without asking permission and crouched beside the broken shelter wall. Her gloved hand brushed the sod once, then the drifted snow, then the open ground where the wind had scoured everything bare. You built the walls wrong, she said. Ellie's face hardened. Mara looked up. Not because you're foolish, because this hill is meaner than it looks. That took some of the sting out of it. Ellie glanced away. I packed them thick. I sealed the gaps. I turned the entrance off the north side. And the ridge turned on you anyway. Ellie gave the smallest nod. Mara stood and pointed toward the western edge. See how the snow won't stay. See how the gusts cut across instead of circling around. This place doesn't have anything left to slow the wind before it hits. No brush line, no willow strip, no low trees, nothing to catch snow, nothing to hold moisture, nothing to break the force. Ellie looked again at the old roots in the ground. Mara saw her notice. Exactly, she said. This ridge was stripped years ago. Firewood, fence posts, quick profit. Happens all over. Folks take what's living, then act surprised when the land stops helping them. The words settled deep. Ellie looked at her broken shelter, then at the empty slope. And for the first time, she saw the hill differently. Not cruel, not cursed, wounded. She swallowed. So what am I supposed to do? I can't grow trees by tonight. No, Mara said. But you can stop pretending a house alone will save you. She stepped closer, her voice calm and practical. You don't need to beat the wind first. You need to teach it where to go. You need to catch snow where it can help you instead of bury you. You need the ground to start working with you, not against you. Ellie frowned. How? Mara studied her for one long second, as if deciding whether the girl in front of her had enough grit left to hear the truth. Then she said quietly, by spring, willow cuttings. By thaw, shallow snow-catch trenches. By next winter, a living windbreak if you do it right. And before any of that, you stop building on the highest, angriest part of this ridge and start using the slope, like the old-timers use the earth. Ellie stared at her. A living windbreak, snow-catch trenches. The words sounded too slow for desperation, too patient for the kind of cold she felt in her fingers. But they also sounded like something else. A plan. Mara untied the bundle of wood from her saddle and set it down beside Ellie's feet. You can keep trying to outstubborn the weather, she said, or you can learn why the weather keeps winning. Then she looked toward the western drift line, where the snow had settled into one protected curve of land. Tomorrow, she said, I'll come back, and I'll show you where this ridge still remembers how to survive. Mara Quinn came back the next morning exactly when she said she would. That mattered to Ellie more than she wanted to admit. People had promised things before. They had promised to look, to ask around, to keep trying, to come back. Most of them had meant well. Some of them probably believed themselves. But life had taught Ellie that a promise and a return were not always the same thing. Mara returned. She came up the draw on the same steady horse, with a shovel tied along the saddle, a coil of rope, and a bundle of long, pale willow cuttings strapped behind her like kindling. Ellie was already awake, already outside, already trying not to look like she had been watching the slope since first light. Mara noticed anyway. Good, she said, stepping down into the snow. You're still here. Ellie folded her arms against the cold. Didn't have anywhere else to go. Mara gave her a look that was too knowing to be comfortable. Sometimes that's how a place starts becoming yours. They spent the morning walking the lower shoulder of the ridge, not the top. That alone felt wrong to Ellie at first. The highest ground had seemed stronger somehow, more defiant, more worthy of fighting for, but Mara kept shaking her head and pointing to the quieter signs Ellie had missed before. The places where snow rested instead of racing away. The places where the land dipped just enough to soften a crosswind. The places where the earth, even under frost, held a little more give. The hill isn't useless, Mara said. It's just exposed. There's a difference. She showed Ellie how to look at a drift and read what the wind had done to make it. How to study bent grass, frozen ridges, and bare streaks of dirt the way ranchers studied clouds. By noon, Ellie could already see the logic in the chaos. She could tell where the wind struck hardest, where it sheared off, and where a little interruption might force it to loosen its grip. That was when Mara handed her the shovel. "We start here," she said. The ground was not easy, even where the sun had touched the slope. The frost still held on stubbornly. Ellie drove the shovel down with both boots, rocked it, pried up hard slices of crusted earth, and kept going until her shoulders burned. Mara worked beside her without fuss, carving a shallow trench along the contour of the hill instead of straight up and down it. Ellie wiped her sleeve across her nose. "Why sideways?" "Because water runs downhill," Mara said. "Snow melt too, but if you give it a place to pause, some of it stays. And if enough stays, roots have a fighting chance." Ellie looked down at the trench, then at the bundle of willow rods. "You really think those are going to live?" Mara's mouth moved in the smallest hint of a smile. "Willow likes a hard life better than most things." By afternoon, they had dug 3 shallow snow-catch lines, each one following the shape of the slope instead of fighting it. Then Mara cut the willow rods to length and pushed the first one into the earth. "Not dead sticks," she said, "sleeping ones." Ellie took the next cutting and jammed it into the softened edge of the trench. The wood was smooth, cold, and flexible in her gloves. It looked too simple to matter, too small, too late. Yet once she started, something in her steadied. One cutting, then another, then another. A rough line of pale wands began to mark the ridge, like a promise too thin for anybody else to believe. By the time the light turned silver, they had planted more than 40. From the county road below, it must have looked ridiculous. A half-starved 16-year-old girl and a weathered widow, ankle-deep in snow, sticking bare branches into frozen ground on the windiest hill in the county. Ellie almost laughed when she pictured it. Then she heard an actual laugh behind her and turned. A skinny boy in a sheepskin-lined coat stood beside a sagging fence post lower on the slope, grinning like he had stumbled onto the best entertainment of the week. "What are you two doing?" he called. "Building a fence for rabbits." Mara did not even glance up. "Depends. You won." The boy barked out a laugh at that and started up the hill. He could not have been more than 15. Freckles, wind-red cheeks, the easy, restless energy of a ranch kid who had grown up outdoors and trusted his own balance on bad ground. He stopped beside the trench and stared at the willow cuttings. "My dad says nothing grows up here." "Your dad's probably right," Ellie said, breathing hard. "We're trying anyway." The boy studied her face, the shovel, the raw line cut into the ridge. Then he shrugged. "That's better than talking about it." His name was Cal Reed. He had been checking fence breaks for his father and saw them from the road. 10 minutes later, he was carrying snow from a drift in an old feed pan and dumping it along the trench where Mara told him to. No ceremony, no pity, just help. By late afternoon, another visitor came. This one did not laugh. He arrived in a wagon with split stone in the back, reined in below the ridge, and climbed up with the slow, stiff steps of an older man whose body had worked hard for a long time. His beard was white, his coat was dusted with granite powder, and his eyes were narrow with professional disapproval before he ever spoke. He looked at Ellie's ruined shelter, then at the slope she had chosen. Then he said, "If you put your next doorway facing open wind again, girl, you may as well sleep standing in the creek." Mara snorted softly. "Good afternoon to you too, Jonah." So this was Jonah Pike. He crouched near the trench, rubbed the soil between 2 thick fingers, and nodded once. "Smart enough," he said. "Not fast, but smart." Ellie stood with the shovel in both hands, cold and tired and too wary to trust praise that sounded like an insult. Jonah pointed his chin toward the lower shoulder of the ridge. "When you're ready to build again, you build there, back into the slope. Low roof, small entry. You use the ground for cover instead of asking the sky for mercy." Then he turned and headed back toward his wagon, as if he had said all a person needed to say. That night, after Mara rode home and Cal disappeared down the fence line, and Jonah's wagon lights faded into the dark, Ellie stood alone beside the fresh trench lines. The wind still came. The cold still cut. The ridge was still a hard place to belong. But now, for the first time, it no longer felt empty. It felt like work had begun. The change did not come all at once. That was the first lesson Ellie learned after the trenches were cut and the willow rods were planted. There was no miracle morning, no sudden softness in the weather, no grand sign from the sky telling her the ridge had finally decided to spare her. The wind still came hard across the open country. The cold still found her sleeves, her collar, the weak places in her gloves. But little by little, in ways only a person paying close attention would notice, the hill began to behave differently. After the next light snowfall, The drifts no longer blew clean off every slope. Some of the snow caught in the shallow contour lines Mara had helped her dig. Some gathered behind the planted willow cuttings and stayed there. Thin at first, then a little deeper with each passing day. It was not enough to call protection yet, but it was enough to prove that the ridge could be taught. Ellie stood over the first snow that held where it was supposed to hold. And for a moment she did not say anything. Mara, beside her, only nodded. There, she said. That's the beginning. The words settled warm in Ellie's chest. Not safety, not success, just the beginning. By then, Jonah Pike had returned twice. He never announced himself. He simply appeared in that slow, stern way of his, with a wagon full of flat stone, a short-handled hammer, and the expression of a man who thought most people made life harder than it had to be. He never asked Ellie whether she still meant to stay. By now, maybe he understood that she did. On the third morning, he stood on the lower shoulder of the ridge, looked toward the lines of trapped snow, and pointed with two thick fingers. Here, he said, not on the crown of the hill, not where Ellie had first tried to prove herself. Here, on a slope tucked just low enough to steal a little mercy from the land. The ground rose behind it. The trenches curved above it. The new drifts sat farther upslope like the first rough sketch of a shield. Jonah jabbed the toe of his boot into the earth. You build into this bank, keep the profile low. Let the ground carry part of the burden. Ellie looked at the spot, then at him. And the wind, you stop inviting it through the front door. That was as close to kindness as Jonah Pike ever came. So they began again. Cal showed up before noon with a crooked grin, a split lip, and 2 old burlap sacks full of straw his father had not missed yet. Mara came later with cord, scrap cloth, and a sack of dried beans. None of them made much of a speech about it. They just arrived and started helping, which, to Ellie, felt stranger and sweeter than pity ever could. Jonah laid the stone first. He taught Ellie how to choose the flatter pieces for the base and the heavier ones for the outside corners. He showed her how to lean the back wall into the slope so the earth itself could insulate it. He made her reset 3 stones she thought were good enough, then made her reset them again. A wall doesn't care how tired you are, he said. Ellie pressed her cold fingers to the edge of the rock and tried again. This time, Jonah grunted once. For him, that was praise. Mara worked on the entrance. She refused to let Ellie face it toward the open sweep of the north and west winds. Instead, she marked out a narrow opening angled away from the main gusts, then helped her shape a short, bent approach so the coal could not rush straight inside. Cal packed straw into gaps. Ellie mixed frozen dirt, snowmelt, and loose earth into a rough mortar. Jonah set a ring of stone for the firebox and built a low chimney throat that would draw smoke without stealing every ounce of heat. They worked until their backs ached and the winter light thinned to pewter. By the 4th day, the shelter began to look less like desperation and more like intention. It was small, humble, half sunk into the slope, with a low roof braced by salvaged timber and packed over with sod, straw, and dirt. But it was solid, thoughtful, shaped by hard weather instead of wishful thinking. When Ellie crouched inside for the first time before nightfall, she noticed something that nearly undid her. It was quiet. Not perfectly quiet. The wind still moved outside, combing over the ridge and pushing fine snow against the outer wall. But inside, the noise had changed. It no longer sounded like winter trying to pry her loose from the earth. It sounded distant, manageable, like something she might endure instead of something that would devour her. Cal ducked into the doorway behind her and looked around with open admiration. Feels like a real place, he said. Ellie kept her eyes on the fire ring. It's just a shelter. Cal shrugged. Looks like a home to me. The word hit deeper than he knew. For a second, Ellie could not answer. Home. She had spent so many years thinking of that word as something other people were given by blood, by luck, by memory. Something fixed and far away. Something she had once lost in a place she could not even picture clearly anymore. But now, kneeling in a stone shelter cut into a Wyoming ridge, with straw on the walls and dirt under her nails and smoke soon to rise from a chimney she had helped build, she felt the shape of a dangerous new thought. Maybe home was not always a place a person returned to. Maybe sometimes it was a place a person made. That night, the storm came in hard. Wind struck the ridge after dark and kept striking. In long, muscular gusts that would have flattened her first shelter and buried the second. Snow hissed across the roof. The chimney trembled once, then held. The little fire bent and recovered. Heat gathered slowly in the small room, touching the stone, the packed earth, the straw-lined seams. Ellie lay awake for hours, listening, waiting for the collapse, waiting for the failure, waiting for winter to take back what it had allowed. But it did not. And sometime just before dawn, with the fire reduced to a red glow and the walls still standing around her, Ellie Brooks fell asleep warm enough to dream. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the ridge no longer looked like a place that wanted Ellie gone. It still wore snow in the hollows. The wind still crossed it with a hard, restless voice. But now, for the first time, something on that lonely rise was answering back. The trenches held their lines. The snow that once raced off the slope now settled and curved. Deliberate bands where Mara had said it would. The willow cuttings, those sleeping sticks everyone would have laughed at a month earlier, stood quiet and pale above the drifts. They did not look like much yet, not to a stranger, but Ellie had learned enough to see what mattered. Moisture was staying. The ground would not wake in spring as empty as it had before, and the shelter held. That changed something deep inside her. At first, Ellie still slept like a person expecting to be driven out. She woke at every gust. Every creak in the timbers made her sit up straight. Every silence felt temporary, as if the world were only resting before it took one more thing from her. But little by little, the night stopped feeling like a test. The firebox Jonah built kept its heat longer than she would have believed. The banked earth behind the stone wall held warmth into morning. The narrow entry, turned away from the hard north wind, no longer invited the cold straight into her bedroll. Even her hands changed. They no longer shook every time she reached for a match. One morning, Cal ducked inside carrying a sack of feed corn and a grin too big for his face. "You know what my dad called this place yesterday?" he asked. Ellie looked up from the kettle. "What?" Cal leaned against the doorway. Pleased with himself, he said, "That girl's made the warmest spot for 5 miles, and she did it on the stupidest hill in the county." Ellie tried not to smile. Tried and failed. By March, the snow began to soften in the afternoon light. The ridge dripped instead of groaned. Thin threads of meltwater slipped into the trenches instead of running uselessly downhill. Mara came up one morning, crouched near the line of willow cuttings, and touched one with her bare fingers. Then she looked at Ellie. "See that?" Ellie stepped closer. At first, she saw nothing. Then she saw it. A bud, tiny, red-brown, tight as a pinhead, but alive. She stared at it so long that Mara laughed under her breath. "Told you," Mara said. "Willow likes a hard life better than most things." Ellie reached out, then stopped herself before touching it. Something about that little bud felt too important to disturb. All winter long, she had been trying to survive one more night. One more storm, one more hard morning. But that bud meant the ridge was doing more than sparing her. It was beginning to live again. News traveled the way it always does in rural places. Quiet at first. Then all at once, a rancher came to ask Jonah how Ellie had set the firebox so it drew without swallowing all the heat. Another came to ask Mara about the trenches holding meltwater on a windy slope. Then one of the Reed boys mentioned that Ellie's shelter stayed warmer than a drafty bunkhouse down by the creek. And suddenly folks had reasons to ride up and see for themselves. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because they were practical enough to recognize a smart idea, even if it had come from a 16-year-old girl they had once pitied from a distance. And some came because people are drawn to stubborn hope, especially when it works. Ellie did not know what to do with that attention at first. She had spent so much of her life trying to take up less space that being seen still felt dangerous. But Mara had a way of brushing past fear without letting it become the center of the room. Jonah answered questions when he felt like it and ignored the foolish ones. Cal treated every visitor like they had shown up late to something he already knew was important. So Ellie stayed. She showed people the trench lines. She showed them how the snow had drifted where the slope was finally being asked to help. She showed them the angled entry, the low roof, the earthen bank that held heat when the night got sharp. And every time she did, the place became more real. Not just a shelter, not just a hiding place, a beginning. By the second thaw, the willow buds had multiplied. The ridge that had once seemed flayed open by weather now held the first fragile signs of softness. Life returning one careful inch at a time. That evening, Ellie stood outside her shelter with the blue scarf wrapped loose around her neck. The sunset stretched wide over the Wyoming land, gold fading into lavender, then into the deep blue of coming night. Cal had gone home. Jonah had taken the wagon down before dark. Mara was already a dim shape in the lower draw. For the first time in a long while, Ellie was alone without feeling abandoned. She looked across the ridge and thought about the child she had once been. The little girl at the fair, the missing hand, the lost road. The years spent believing that home was something that disappeared when other people let go of you. Maybe that was true for some people, but not for her. Because here was the proof, standing all around her. Home could also be something you built with blistered hands, something you shaped out of wind, earth, is stone, patience, and the stubborn refusal to disappear, something that did not wait for permission to exist. So let me ask you something. When life has taken so much from you that even the word home feels uncertain, do you keep looking backward for what was lost? Or do you find the courage to build something new with what remains? Ellie lifted her face into the cold evening air and watched the first star appear above the ridge. Then she turned, stepped inside the warm shelter she had fought for, and closed the door behind her. And if this story stayed with you, if you believe people can still grow through hardship, still build hope out of almost nothing, subscribe to the channel and come back for the next story.